Yeah, I'd like to get into more of the transgenerational trauma
Mhm.
side of things, because this is something a term I've only heard recently, where people are exploring how trauma from someone's parents or grandparents are passed all the way down. And I think we're gonna, cover big T, small T, little things as again. But
Right.
yeah, how did you start learning about it? And maybe you can give us a good overview of exactly what transgenerational trauma is.
The way I got interested in it is I've been following the research for a long time. Now it's called transgeneration. It used to be intergenerational. It's the same thing.
Okay.
Um, I'm Jewish, and I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are children of Holocaust survivors.
Hmm.
So we've been talking about it for years about what it's like, and what, not maybe in terms of what gets passed down, but what the experience is like growing up to be the child of a Holocaust survivor. I also had a very dear colleague, Dr. Ruth Heber in New York City, who was herself the child of a Holocaust survivor and a very talented and wonderful trauma therapist herself. And she and I collaborated. I said, Ruth, what you know has to be um, passed down, and before you die. And there was, all the Holocaust survivors were being wiped out, and not that many of them became therapists, so that we're able to really talk about the experience and make sense of it. So those are the two ways that I got involved in it initially, and just to start to describe it and look at our patients who had been um, children or grandchildren of, whether it was mass genocides, or racism, so, and then people started writing about it in the different cultures. I think with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and Black Lives Matter, people were writing about it before, about, the effects just of racism, right? Or structural, systemic racism. But um, uh, people were paying attention now about what it's been like to be, for example, a Black person in the US, and starting to look back on the impact of slavery on one's sense of self. And Joy DeGroy wrote about it in 2005, but many people started reading it in 2020. And, she talked
Okay.
about the impact in terms of maybe coping mechanisms, like holding on to a lot of anger because, and then it coming out because of all the generations of being shamed, etc. So, and then Native Americans are beginning, some clinicians are starting to look at it and how to heal, etc. So,
And
but the
do
issue
they think that's more?
specifically, yeah, the issue specifically about transgenerational trauma, because that was just kind of, being able to talk about it clinically. But Rachel Yehuda, a New York City based um, psychiatrist, was one of the leading um, authors and researchers really into examining epigenetics of intergenerational trauma. So what she found, she looked at, there were a few very seminal studies. One is on 9/11 mothers during who witnessed 9/11 or were very impacted by it, but when they were pregnant,
Okay.
and what happened with their children's genes versus like a control group of pregnant mothers from that time period who did not experience 9/11. And wouldn't you know, what she found was that babies born to these 9/11 mothers had much higher cortisol rates. What does that mean? Cortisol is one of those stress hormones. It's I don't know how much detail to get into it, but what the way it manifests, if it gets expressed genetically, is that you have a much higher propensity to reactivity and to a stress response. So if you think of people's like tolerance of emotion and threat, as kind of a window, those children were born with a much narrower bandwidth. So things could get them more distressed more quickly. And then there was further research with other populations, Holocaust survivors, second generation. So there's something that happens in the change of the genes. The 9/11 study looked at when you were pregnant, but lo and behold, it's not, the trauma doesn't have to happen when you're pregnant. It
Okay.
can happen before you're pregnant, and it changes the genes being exposed to that
So
degree,
even
especially.
even before you're pregnant, if you have some sort of
Yes,
traumatic experience, the
correct.
epigenetics will lay on top of your DNA, which will then be passed on to the child. That's the theory right
Correct.
now.
It's the theory. The research shows it very, very strongly.
Okay.
They used to
And then
think
for people like that who have that lower bandwidth, I suppose, for stress or disturbance, has there been anything that has been shown to improve those things? I think I saw
yes,
on your website biofeedback. Is that the same as neurofeedback?
yeah, that no, it's different.
Okay.
But neurofeedback, I took the training. There's part one, and I didn't continue because the way I work, I wasn't going to be putting electrodes into people's heads. But
Right.
I wanted to study it to see what it does. So having a lot of good success. I don't follow the fields so carefully, so you can't. I'm not an expert on it, but what I know is that it helps widen people's bandwidth of tolerance, and also this is not a, oh my God, once you have transgenerational trauma you're doomed, and the gene. We know about neuroplasticity now,
Hmm.
so we know that good treatment um, can certainly help. And also, a lot of things that get passed down are not just the genetics. There's also theoretically that people who've been exposed, especially to malevolent trauma, the
Hmm.
Khmer Rouge, things like that, where if there's interpersonal malevolent violence against a people,
Okay.
um, that the rates are very high later for PTSD. And so part of it could be the genetic component, and part of it is that it affects you. Untreated trauma, affects you, so it affects
Right.
your style of parenting. You could be, if you had to adapt as a survivor of the Khmer Rouge, and you adapted by the freeze response and dissociated, so that you just were feel very disconnected from everything, then the child is experiencing a parent who's very disconnected. A lot of times, parents, grandparents who've been through, really horrible stuff either talk about it too much, which could be very activating too soon, or don't talk about it at all. So when, like my husband's father was a World War II vet, he, on the front lines, he didn't talk about it. It was just too activating. They set it aside. Does that mean that my husband wasn't affected by the trauma that his dad suffered? No,
Right.
it doesn't mean that, because his father responded to the trauma in certain ways
Right.
by minimizing, because that's what he had to do. So he,
Hmm.
minimized people's feelings and told them to buck up. So it
Right.
affects.
Or even if
But
he was more
yeah,
withdrawn from his relationship with his children, or from family life, because he's spending so much emotional energy not paying attention to the trauma. Is that accurate?
well, it didn't cause him to disconnect from
No,
the
I'm just
family.
saying theoretically, if like
Well,
that.
theoretically, though, what it does is if the person has disconnected from their own feelings, how can they teach a child to connect to their feelings?
Right.
So if the child is having a lot of feelings, their response is to minimize the same way they had to minimize.
Right.
You see, so things get passed down by the parenting style
Right.
and
Well,
what's transmitted. So it can go generation to generation of internalized oppression and internalized racism. And so you're raised generation after generation with, shame about being Black, or, but the issue is the brain is very neuroplastic. And not only does trauma get passed down, but resources get passed down.
right.
So how they got through, you know, gets
Right.
passed down, a certain strength, a certain dignity, a certain holding on to humanity, their humanity. So there's a lot of strengths when you do transgenerational work.
Hmm.
You don't just look at, what's been passed down in a negative way. You also, look at the strengths and.